What's up, my good peoples? I am James Anderson. Have you ever asked the question, who am I and what the freak should I do with my life? These are very common questions, but what's not so commonly known is that there's answers to these questions. You see, everything God created, He created on purpose, with a purpose, for a purpose. But when you misunderstand who God is, you misunderstand who you are. When you misunderstand these two things, you base your life off of misconceptions and deceptions, right? So the way you view life affects your priorities, which then affects your decisions, which then affects your results. But when you start to understand who God really is, you start to understand who you are. And this is when life really starts to open up, right? When you start to find out who you are, that starts answering question number one, which is, who am I? When you start to find out who you are, you start to find purpose and vision, which starts answering question number two, which is, what the freak should I do with my life? None of these are questions that we need to run around in. We're called to know who we are and know who God is. That's natural, that's normal. It's abnormal and a malfunction to live a life outside of that. So Jesus says in John 15, right? He says, if you remain in me and my words, my teachings remain in you, then ask whatever you wish, whatever you desire, and it'll be done for you. Because it's to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, and that fruit proves that you're my disciples. This is beautiful. And it's also real specific. So let's break it down. So he says, if you remain in me and my words remain in you. So he says, if you remain in me, this is where we belong and this is where we came from. Outside of this, it's a malfunction. Inside of this is function. So right before this, Jesus says, I am the vine and you are the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Life does not function outside of God. That's a law and a reality. Work outside of that, you'll only find malfunction. Work inside of that, and this is where life is. So if you remain in me and my words, my teachings remain in you, right? So we're talking about the kingdom reality, kingdom principles, values. What God holds dear is what you hold dear. See, when what He holds dear is what you hold dear, then He's like, ask whatever you wish, whatever you desire, because your desires are based upon the kingdom of heaven. He says, whatever you wish, whatever you desire, ask, and I'll give it to you, because it's to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, which means two things. The fruit that you're bearing has to do with the kingdom of heaven. And you bearing fruit, you succeeding, brings glory to the Father. Jesus said in John 14 that the Son brings glory to the Father. Jesus is invested in bringing glory to the Father, and He's invested in using you to do that. And to do that means you need to bear fruit, which I'm telling you means that you were created to succeed. And He ends this by saying that fruit proves that you're His disciples, which means fruit is the proof and the evidence that we are in God. If you do not bear fruit, it could be said that you are not in God. He says any branch that does not bear fruit is cut off. I'm not talking about a works-based mentality. I'm just talking about this is just straight up how we function normally inside of God. I'm not trying to earn anything. Inside of God, there's just so much life that this is just the beautiful things that are produced. So it says in Romans 12, it says, do not be conformed any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you can test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. So do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, right? This is where you malfunction, because this is apart from God. So he says, don't hold your values. Don't hold sacred what the world holds sacred, right? Don't have your relationships, your marriages. Don't raise your kids. Don't do all these things like the world does it. He says, no, instead be transformed. Don't follow this pattern. Instead, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Become totally different by changing the way you think. So be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Renewing means to bring back to the original, to make what is as it once was. We're talking about God's original intent in the Garden of Eden and what Jesus restored. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, who God really is and who you really are. He says, then, specific, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, then. Then you can test and approve what God's will is. So this test and approve is like a scientist. He busts out his Bunsen burners, his beakers, his Petri dishes, plugs in his microscope, and he's ready to rock out some tests. So you do a bunch of tests, you catalog all your results, and then from there you make your conclusion. Where it can go awry is that if your testing phase is inaccurate, the results that you bear will be inaccurate. So if the ingredients you use, if the data you use, if the numbers you have are wrong, then you will get results, but your results will be inaccurate. So you could say, right, I've heard these verses. I've gone to church. I've prayed these prayers. I fasted. I gave my life to God. I went and tried to serve Him, and I got beat up, broke down, jacked up, lost my identity, got poor. I'm angry, confused, and bitter. All that junk is for real. But the reality is that when you misunderstand who God is, when we hold incorrect information, I'm not saying anybody goes out on purpose and be like, yeah, man, I want to go use incorrect information. It's just possible to be deceived. So when the image of God that you hold is incorrect, it affects your entire life. So be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now, Jesus says something pretty fascinating, and it went to the tune of this. He says, go into all the world and make disciples of nations. Now, to make disciples of nations, right, this is not something you stumble into. This is something you set out to do on purpose, which speaks of us being people of purpose, on purpose, with a purpose. So there's this Old Testament verse, and it goes like this. It says, the people who know God do great exploits. The people who know God do great exploits. And on the flip side of that coin, it says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. My people perish for lack of revelation. Revelation, to reveal, means to unveil, which means that you're able to see something that you couldn't see before but was already there. We are created to know God. Jesus said He came to bring sight to the blind and release the captives from prison. But I tell you, it's possible to be free but live as a prisoner. It's possible to be rich but live like you're poor. Change the way you think. Change your life.